Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants have been placed on a listen-only mode until today's question-and-answer session. This call is being recorded. If anyone does have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And I'd now like to turn the call over to Michelle Carnes. You may begin.
Thank you, Kathy. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar today. We're very excited to have some wonderful folks on the line today to talk to you about the Trevor Ally Training and to talk about it generally, but also to talk about it in terms of how it's been implemented in one of our grants for the Garrett Lee Smith program. I'm Michelle Carnes here at SAMHSA, and there's two folks you're going to be hearing from today. Nathan Bellew, who is the Education Director at Trevor Project, will be our main presenter, and then Morgan Keenan, who's from our Missouri grant. He's the Eastern Coordinator for the Trevor Project in Missouri, and so he's going to talk a little bit about how this particular training has been implemented in Missouri. So at this time, I'm going to have Nathan get started with our webinar on the Trevor Ally Training.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you for that introduction. So there you see our pictures. So my name is Nathan Bellew, and as Michelle stated, I am the Education Director at the Trevor Project. Just a little bit about me as we get started. I have been with the Trevor Project for almost 3 years. And prior to coming to the Trevor Project, I worked in the state of North Carolina at the university level, also doing LGBTQ awareness and suicide prevention as well. So that's a little bit about my background. My work now is at the national level, but I've also done work more at the local level. And Morgan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Morgan Keenan, and as it says on the slide, I'm the Regional Coordinator for Missouri East for the Trevor Project, implementing sort of the care and ally trainings that you're going to talk about today. And a little bit more background about me is I kind of, being in a smaller state of Missouri in the Midwest, I kind of get to wear a lot of many hats, as I'm sure that a lot of you all do on the phone as well. So a lot of my work is with young people and youth development, as well as suicide prevention, alcohol and substance abuse prevention. So I really sort of play the gamut when it comes to doing work with young people, especially LGBT young people. So I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. And later in this webinar, Morgan will talk more about kind of contextually how Morgan has been implementing this program, which we're going to talk about today, the Trevor Ally program, actually on the ground in Missouri, and giving you some of that context of what that looks like so you can kind of think about what that might look like to implement it as part of the work that you're doing. So again, we're so pleased that all of you have chosen to join us today. This is an outline of our goals for today for the next about an hour and a half. We want to talk a little bit about LGBTQ education in the context of suicide prevention. So many of you, perhaps, if you have a Garrett Lee Smith grant, might have the LGBTQ population as part of your grant, which is really exciting. And then there's that question, how do you really integrate that effectively into suicide prevention work? So we'll talk about that. The next thing we'll talk about really is the Trevor Ally Training. And so we're going to really walk you through the training and provide an example of what this type of education looks like so you can kind of conceptualize how this has been working for us. I'll provide an outline, obviously, of that training, the learning objectives for this type of training, and we'll talk about what we feel needs to be presented if you're going to speak on this content. We'll also talk about the services from the Trevor Project. So this is something we always do actually as part of the Trevor Ally Training, but I also want to make sure that all of us on the phone are aware of both the services that we provide directly for youth, but then also all of the different education resources, for instance, the Trevor Ally program being one of them, that you can integrate into the work that you're doing. And then we'll talk with Morgan as kind of a case study of what Morgan's been doing in Missouri and how that actually does work on the ground. And then I'll also share with you some ideas from our end of how we would like to work with you and how we can be helpful perhaps in integrating this information and this content into what you're already doing. And then we definitely want to allow some time. We'll open up the phones at the end. We'll open up the line for you all to ask questions and for us to have a conversation around the material and the content that you're going to see. So first of all, this topic of LGBTQ education and competency education. First of all, I think that it is important to state that if you're going to do work with LGBTQ youth, specifically suicide prevention, that you both as someone, a suicide prevention educator and specialist, that you yourself need to have some baseline level of competency around LGBTQ youth. I think that kind of goes without saying, right? It would be difficult to actually provide effective services to this population, especially suicide prevention services, without really understanding them. And then most likely as part of your grant, you would realize that in order to really decrease the risk for suicide for this population, that we're most likely also providing education to folks who work with youth, anyone else that we're doing suicide prevention education with, around also LGBTQ issues. So there's kind of two sides to that coin, both the LGBTQ youth that we would work with and then also the folks who might work with youth. And so us as the folks who are providing that education, we need to make sure that we understand LGBTQ young people and that we understand the challenges they're facing and that we understand their identity. That being said, our next point really would be that it's important to make sure that our training and our programs that we're using around this topic are in line with best practice. So I would say really when we think about it, LGBTQ education within this context of the community of us that are doing suicide prevention, this is a fairly new topic. There have been folks that have been talking about this for many years, but maybe all of us really weren't giving it a lot of attention. Really since maybe the fall of 2010, there's been a lot more attention to the fact that LGBTQ youth are about 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. And because of that, a lot of us have said, hey, we're going to start doing this type of work, which is really fantastic. That being said, as with anything we do in suicide prevention, we want to make sure that the programs that we're doing are actually working. And so part of our learning objective really for this today is to help all of us realize that we don't have to recreate the wheel. So if perhaps you've said you're going to work with LGBTQ youth as a special population in your grant, there's not a need necessarily to create a brand new program. There are programs that have been created that are working, and so it's really important to make sure that you understand what those programs are. So a few examples of that, I'll talk about some of them actually that are in the Best Practice Registry from the Trevor Project in the later part of this presentation. But if you go to the Best Practice Registry, which is maintained by the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, you'll find the list of several programs, and I think right now there are about 4 of them. The third point is that when we're thinking about helping folks to become competent to work with LGBTQ youth, we can think of this really from 2 different directions. Both our service providers and us ourselves, we need to just have that baseline level of competency. And then there's the additional conversation of LGBTQ youth mental health and their risk for suicide. At the Trevor Project, we divide that into 2 different trainings. And so the training that we're going to walk you through today is the Trevor Ally Training. And its goal really, as you'll see in the next slide, is to provide that baseline level of competency. Our Trevor Care Training, which Michelle will talk about at the closure, we're going to do a webinar of that training next week. That training really, its goal is to provide competency around LGBTQ youth mental health. So it talks about why LGBTQ youth are at higher risk for suicide. It talks about their unique risk factors and their unique protective factors. Just briefly before we get started with the Trevor Ally presentation, I'll say the reason that we've divided that into 2 separate curriculum is that we've found that if we try just to have a conversation around LGBT youth and their risk for suicide, that a lot of folks that we were working with, school counselors, social workers, educators, we really couldn't assume their baseline level of knowledge. So some individuals maybe had never had a training around LGBTQ youth before. Maybe some individuals had, but they maybe were a little resistant to the topic for a variety of issues, which is understandable. And so we were finding that it was difficult to have a conversation about how to help if there were also some maybe fears about helping, some misunderstandings about the population, and maybe some reticence to help. So with that in mind, we found that really the best practice, if we were really going to reach our goals around helping folks to act in a way that will decrease the risk for suicide for LGBTQ youth, we had to first give them a space to talk about who LGBTQ youth were and to really raise their baseline level of competency. And that's why we started doing this kind of two-tiered model. There was a webinar that was done sometime back, actually, through SPRC, which some of you maybe were on the line for, and we talked about this topic. It was probably about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago now. And there were several folks that talked about the fact that that's the model that they've been using, that it hasn't been sufficient to just kind of throw a few slides as part of a QPR training or an ASSIST training or a safe talk about LGBTQ youth, that they've really found they need to do a substantive additional training. And so this training that I'm going to walk you through today really is an example of what that would look like if you do a training that's just about LGBTQ youth prior to having maybe a gatekeeper education training. So this is an outline of the Trevor Ally training. So the training that I'm going to walk you through now, and a few kind of basics about the training before I walk you through this outline, is that this training usually takes about 2 hours. It can be done in about an hour and a half. And so we're not actually going to do all of the training with you on the phone today. The goal of this training is to walk you through each section and help you kind of understand what the learning objectives would be, really expose you to the tool, and then again have that time to really discuss with you how this can be used contextually and how you can get access to it, how you could actually use this tool. So hopefully as you go through these sections, it might give you some ideas of things you can do yourself, and hopefully also it will get you excited about doing this type of training. So if we're going to do a Trevor Ally training, this would be the outline. We talk about what it means to become an ally, which you'll see in a few moments. We talk about gender and sexuality and the difference between gender and sexual orientation. We do seek to give folks information about all the letters. I think that's one thing that if people really are letting their guard down and they're being honest, they're like, what do all these letters mean? And that's a really fair question to ask. And so we talk about that. We talk about the coming out process. So what does it mean to come out as LGBTQ? And why is it important to understand the coming out process? And I'll walk you through that. Then we talk about providing support. So we give recommendations around how to provide support, and then also how to take action. So what would it actually look like to support a youth who is LGBTQ? We have additional modules as well that are tailored for higher education settings. So for those of you who have a campus-based grant, we have ones that are specialized for K through 12 school settings. So if you're doing work with teachers and school counselors and administrators, school nurses. And then we have one that's tailored specifically for health professionals as well. So this training most definitely, another thing to say is this training is an adult training. So this is for adults. This is not for young people. When we talk later, I'll talk about 2 different tools that we do have for young people. I think something very important to say is that when you're thinking about doing suicide prevention that affects LGBTQ youth, it's not really appropriate to use an adult training with a young person. And I think that probably should go without saying, but I have encountered some folks that have taken an adult training that was intended for professionals and tried to tweak it a little bit and then use it directly with young people. Maybe use it directly in the classroom, maybe directly with LGBTQ youth. And I think it's really important to say that that doesn't really work. It's not really effective. And the way that you talk about suicide with a group of young people should be very different than the way you talk about it with adults. And that's the same thing when you're talking specifically to LGBTQ young people. So you wouldn't take this tool, for instance, and say, oh, I have a suicide prevention tool now for LGBT young people. It's a very different conversation. But we'll talk about those tools for young people that we have as well. So this is a basic outline of how we would get started at the beginning of an ally training. The first thing we really like to do is create a safe space. And this is an activity, maybe some of you on the line have done this before. This is actually very common in youth spaces. And if we were all hearing each other right now, I would engage us in this. And basically what this is I would invite us to create a list of things that would make you feel safe to learn in this space. And that list really comes from the audience, from the folks that you're training. And so the list could be things such as, no judgment, being, open to learning, being, step up and step back, so speak and then let others speak. So it's things that really just create that learning environment that make people feel safe to learn. I think this is really important when you're going to do LGBT competency education because it is a sensitive topic. And there'll be people in the room that maybe it's the first time they've ever talked about this. And for whatever reason, they might be very uncomfortable. And if you create a space where everyone understands that it's okay to ask questions, it's okay to disagree and say, I don't agree with that for whatever reason, I think it helps people by creating that space at the beginning to set them up for success in the learning environment. So this is how we would start is with that type of activity. And then this is a little about the Trevor Project. So we do talk about who we are. And for those of you on the line who don't know, the Trevor Project is the leading national organization that provides crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and there should be a comma there, transgender, and questioning youth. And I'll talk more about our services later. Just one quick thing about this statement, we use the term youth very broadly. So the Trevor Project serves youth and young people up to age 24. So it's that very broad youth definition, which many of you probably use as well. We also do another icebreaker type activity to get folks thinking about bias. And so because the goal and the learning objectives of this training are really to help people understand LGBT young people and their community, it's really helpful for them to understand the bias that they may face every day in their environments, unknowing to maybe to many of the folks in the room. And so we do some type of icebreaker. This icebreaker is called True Colors, and we divide folks into small circles, and they have to go around the circle and label the people next to them as a color without knowing them. They assign a color to them. Like, I look at you and I think you're purple. And they go around the circle and do that. And then the individuals have an opportunity to go around the circle a second time and state what color they would choose for themselves. The goal of this activity is really to get people thinking about how we assign labels to people without knowing them and why we do that, and then also what it might feel like to have people assign labels to us and then not have an opportunity to explain and verbalize, actually, this is who I am. So we help folks to debrief from that and process about what that might feel like. A big part of this training, and obviously the learning objective of this particular activity, is to build empathy. And so really we're leading people on a journey from the beginning of this training to the end of really helping them to have an emotional experience and reaction to understanding this population so that they'll be motivated to act not just because they have new facts, but because they've really been moved by understanding the oppression that this population may face. I think that that's an important point because I think when we talk about doing LGBT education, I don't think it's enough to just throw facts and figures at people. Sometimes that's kind of the context that this training takes. Sometimes it's all we have time to do. But I really do feel that if we're thinking about what is the best way to do this type of training to really meet our learning objectives and really get folks to behave in a way or support LGBTQ youth in a way that will actually help them to feel supported, which will decrease their risk for suicide, right? So that's what we're hoping for. If we're actually going to help folks to do that, then we do have to build empathy, and that's really key to getting people to support youth in a way that really is helpful to them. So after that activity, we talk about what does it mean to be an ally. And so this is one brief definition that I use: someone who advocates for and supports members of a community other than their own, reaching across differences to achieve mutual goals. I really like to frame this in the way that, all of us are already allies for folks. So if I could see all of you, I would ask you right now to think about the different populations using this definition that you're already an ally for. Most of us in this line work in suicide prevention, right? So that means that most of us are allies for people who might be in crisis. And we're doing work both professionally and probably personally to help those individuals. And so we're allies for those communities, maybe allies for people who have lost someone to suicide. There are probably other groups, maybe people who are differently abled, people who don't speak English as their first language, a lot of different groups that we could identify that we are allies for if you use this definition. So I think, many times people are nervous when they think of helping LGBT youth. And so what I like to present is, you're already doing this. You're already an ally. And so what this conversation is to help you to figure out how you can build upon the skill set you already have that's really great and figure out how to use it to help a different group, a new group of young people who you maybe haven't helped before. The emphasis really is on action. And so I like these quotes, which I have the citation there from where I took this from, is that the goal of an ally is to act. So there's action involved. And so it's not necessarily doing something for someone, but doing something with someone. And so there's some other phrases there that we could use to think about this as to how you would operationalize this, such as currently operating in solidarity with, showing support for, operating with intentionality around, using my privilege to help by, demonstrating my commitment to end, and in this case maybe oppression or victimization of LGBTQ youth, showing up for LGBT people in the following ways, so that the emphasis is going to really be how can you actually help this group, not just understand them, but how can you act. Becoming an ally, and we help folks to understand, becoming an ally is not an overnight event. So folks are not going to take this training and suddenly they get a gold star and they are an ally for LGBT people. It's a lifelong process. But to begin that process as part of this training, they can have a commitment to learn and to grow, to know it's okay to make mistakes, which is really important. It's okay to not know the right word. It's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to ask questions of the person you're trying to help. It's important to not make assumptions, and it's really important to take what you're learning and use it to help others. So these are just some basics of what it means to be an ally. The next part of the training, after setting that framework, which I think is a really important step, is to say, okay, now we've all come here to understand who are LGBTQ youth. And so now we're going to provide some tools within this framework of thinking about how we can act to actually support LGBTQ young people and to help LGBTQ youth. So the learning objectives from this section really are to help them to walk away with the language and the tools that will help them to feel a little more confident in actually supporting this population. So we start really at the ground floor, a very, very basic level. And some people maybe will know this, but again, we don't like to assume knowledge, so some people may not. So we talk about sexual orientation and gender identity and how they're different. Sexual orientation being to whom we feel attracted, and gender identity being about how we identify our gender, regardless of what our bodies look like, that they're two different and separate things. And so when we think about all the different words and acronyms that the community uses, they fall into these two different categories, and they are different, and it's important to know that. Talking about sexual orientation, we talk about the fact that sexual orientation is not just about whom someone has sex with or who someone is physically intimate with. It's really so much more than that. And, I think an important thing in this type of training is to make people, it's okay for people to laugh. I like to talk about the fact that, if the folks in the room, if they think about why they're attracted to the person that they're with, if they're partnered, if they were to list off a lot of different reasons, the reasons would most likely not be, well, because of the fact that they have the opposite set of sexual organs, if they happen to be a straight person, right? It would be a lot of other reasons, and some of the reasons are listed here. emotional reasons, romantic, physical, and even spiritual. People are attracted to people in a lot of different ways. And so when someone is consistently attracted to someone of the same sex in all of these ways, then that might say that they are gay, or they might choose to say they're lesbian, or if they're attracted to both, they might say that they're bisexual. But it's so much more than just a sexual attraction. There's all of these components, and it's a very complex type of attraction, just like it is for anyone. At a very basic level, we talk about the fact that sex and gender are not the same. And we talk about all the ways that our society confuses those two, because we confuse them as being synonyms. But it's really important, if we're going to understand this community, which is very diverse, that those two things are not the same. And we talk about, on paperwork, right? So many times folks will ask for your gender. Well, what they really mean is, what is your biological sex? And so then we delve a little more into that. Sex is a physical thing. It's a biological thing. It's your genitals, your gonads, your hormones, your chromosomes. All those things make up sex. It doesn't make up your gender. Your gender is, what does it mean to be seen as male or female, masculine or feminine. And that's not really what people are asking usually when they ask about your gender, but those are actually how those two things are divided. Then we like to have a conversation about the fact that, and we sometimes do some activities around this, that in society we frequently create binaries. So I even did that just in my last slide, where I talked about male versus female, and I talked about man versus woman. And so we create boxes. A really key and basic thing to understanding working with LGBTQ youth is that young people today are really seeing their identities in a much more complex way than binaries. They're seeing their identity along continuums in so many ways, not only with their sexual orientation, but also with their gender, how they understand themselves as masculine or feminine. And they see themselves along binaries and how they express that to the world. And this is a really important point to understand, because so many times the bias that we hear expressed against LGBTQ young people has to do with the fact that folks are more comfortable when people are fitting into binaries. So a few really good examples of that, things that I've heard, and maybe you've heard this too. When I'm talking to, say, a room full of educators, I've had educators say to me, I have this young person in my class, and I've told them, if they would just stop acting so gay, then everything would be okay. They would stop being victimized. Now, I like to pause there and ask them, well, what do you mean really when you say they're acting so gay? Well, they're flamboyant, the way that they move their hands and their arms, and, sometimes they wear eyeshadow as a boy, and sometimes he wears some eye makeup, and if he just wouldn't act so gay, it would be okay. So what they're really talking about that young person is not his sexual orientation, right? They're talking about the fact that his gender expression, which we'll get to in a moment, is not in a binary, that he's not expressing himself completely as a man or completely masculine, that he's living along a continuum, and that makes that individual uncomfortable. And it also is making the students around them perhaps react to that student in a negative way. And so by making a statement like that to the student, it really may be showing a lack of support, even though the teacher's intention is to keep the young person safe, which is really important to understand. That's their intention. They're coming from a good place. But it might actually come across to the young person as a lack of support of their identity. So if we're going to support young people where they are, we have to really understand how they see themselves. And so it's important to understand that young people see themselves along a continuum. These next couple slides help us with that. We like to use this, and there's another after that I think is even a little more fun, to describe the fact that folks live along continuums, both when it comes to biological sex, which we've been spending some time talking about, when it comes to gender identity, so how do you see yourself as a man or a woman, when it comes to gender expression, and when it comes to sexual orientation, that really people see themselves along a continuum, along a line. So someone could fall anywhere on this line between these various categories. They don't always have to be at one end of the spectrum or another. Again, I think even a better way of showing this is the genderbread person, which some of you may have seen before. It's really a fantastic way of describing this. Again, you have those categories there on the right of gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, sexual orientation, and then you have this really fun little way of expressing it here. That identity is in your head. How do you see yourself? Your orientation is in your heart. Who are you attracted to? And then your sex is your biological sex, and as frequently understood as expressing itself in that biological way. And then your expression, which is that line all around the outside. So that's how you choose to show all of that to the world, which can be things like clothing. Your gender can be expressed through your clothing. What type of clothing do you wear? How do you adorn yourself? All of that is expression. So again, this is a really great way to help folks to understand that identity is complex. And so what we generally do when we're using these charts is that we, at this point, will have talked about the difference between someone who identifies as gay or lesbian and someone who identifies as transgender and how that's different. And then we'll chart someone perhaps on these gender spectrums and say, okay, let's take an example of a person who might be identifying as a transgender person. So they were born perhaps as a male, they transitioned to be a female. Let's chart them on this chart and see how they might understand themselves in these different contexts. It's a very good visual way for folks to walk away really understanding the LGBTQ youth population. So obviously, I want to make the admission now we're kind of speeding through this content. If you and I were all in a room together, we would really spend some time with this, and we'd answer a lot of your questions. And we'll have time for questions at the end, but we'd spend a lot of time talking about this. These are usually 2 slides I will say we spend probably maybe 25, 30 minutes on because people really need to kind of wrap their mind around these concepts. And then we talk about the fact that, there are a lot of words that young people are using to describe themselves, a lot of words. And so some of them are here. You see them in front of you: two-spirit, pansexual, bigender, queer, trans, asexual, genderqueer. So we talk about what some of those mean. And then, again, we go back to that really basic point of it's okay to not know everything. So some folks, sometimes, I've seen this happen, when you start talking about the fact that LGBTQ young people do use a lot of different words to describe themselves, some folks say, you know what, I'm just going to throw my hands up because that's just too much to do. That's a lot of work, and I never know which word they want to use. And so a really good tool around this is to say, one thing, it's important to know terms, and part of working with youth and understanding youth culture is keeping up with the terms, because this is not the only place where young people have different words they use. It's a lot of different things that we have to keep up with terms. But the secondary part is, a good tool is always to feel comfortable to ask a young person, tell me, what words do you use to describe yourself? And it's okay to ask that and let the young person tell you. So it's, again, important not to maybe label them or use words to describe them, but say, okay, well what words would you like to use to describe yourself? And that way you have a more kind of comfortable way of maybe not having to know all the terms. And if you don't understand the term that they use, you can always say, well, that's not a word I've heard before. Can you tell me what that means to you? And that way you really understand what they're trying to express about their identity. We then do an activity with terminology, because I think it really is important for people not to be scared by all these terms. And so at this point, I think a good kind of kinesthetic way of learning, if we were all in a room together, we would do this right now. I would hand out to half of the group, half of the folks on the line, I would hand out terms, and then to the other half, I would hand out the definitions. And then I would say, find each other. So all of you would be going around the room and saying, I have this term, I have this definition, do they match? And then once we feel like we've all found our matches, we'll stand in a big circle, each person next to their match, and we'll go around the room and read the term and read the definition of that term. And it's a really helpful way to learn terms. It gets you learning with your body. And what's great is people always invariably, there's going to be some mismatches. So it's a really great learning opportunity because they understand that maybe some of the terms didn't mean what they thought that they meant. So the main learning objection, because we're coming to kind of the end of that section around LGBTQ youth, the main learning objectives are to really help individuals have that understanding of how LGBTQ young people are understanding themselves and what their experiences are. You've done some empathy building activities. You've led them through an understanding of who LGBTQ youth are and the words that they use, and now they're feeling like they have some tools in their toolbox. They have some things to help them feel more comfortable and confident, and then that helps them when we go into this next section. And the next section is coming out. So this is another way of helping them to understand LGBTQ young people. We understand these identities. A really important thing to understand if you're going to help LGBTQ young people is the coming out process. And so you see one definition there of coming out. And the important takeaways and learning objectives from this, and I'm not going to go through all of these slides in depth, but the important learning objectives are to help people understand that it's a very delicate time, that it's a somewhat complicated process, that it's really important for the young, especially young people, to be able to own their own process. That when they come out, how they come out, who they come out to needs to be under their control, that they know better than any of us do about the right way to come out for them. And that because it's so delicate, when we get to what can we do to help, we need to be giving thoughts about how we can support young people in the coming out process because it is such a delicate and sensitive time. So understanding the fact that young people are in a developmental process, and it's really good to understand that it's developmental, might be able to help you to empathize and say, like, I think they're maybe in this stage of development right now, and that maybe helps you in how you respond to them and react to them as a young person. But to also understand that their needs are very particular during this time. We know from some research that LGBTQ youth are at higher risk for suicide just before they come out and just after they come out. And that's a lot of times of when the Trevor Project hears from them. And so it's really important to understand how delicate that process is. So at that point, as I said, we would go through this kind of the basics, which is that it's different for every person. As I just stated, that everyone should have control over their own process, that it's a lifelong process. People don't just come out once. They come out over and over and in different places in different ways. And that we're not just talking about one identity, and we haven't talked about that up to this point, but it's really important to understand that LGBTQ people, just like all of us, have multiple identities. So there are LGBTQ youth of color, there are LGBTQ Latino youth, LGBTQ South Asian youth, LGBTQ youth from all over the world, LGBTQ youth with different faith and religious identities, all of these different, very complex identities that they're bringing to the table. And that it's really important when they're coming out to not just label them as a gay young person. Because they're not just a gay young person. They're a gay young person with a lot of different rich identities. And to them, one of these other or several of these other identities, they may feel may play more of a role in their life. So it's important to understand that they're very complex people, that they're not just one type of person. And then I exposed them to this model, and this is from Vivian Cass. This model is relatively old. It's the one that I feel is the simplest to understand. There are other models. If you Google LGBT coming out process online, you'll find a lot of different models. But I walk folks through these 6 different stages. Some of the models that are more recent really help people to appreciate that more than a stage process, it's more like a circle, that people, kind of a spiral, that people come back around and revisit this identity at new times in their life over and over. And I think that's a little more accurate, but I think this really does serve the purpose of helping us to understand that young people go through a process, that there is a process, and that they're not always in the same stage. They're not always going to be in that stage, maybe the stage you encounter them at. So we've walked through now some very basic LGBT identity. We've talked about coming out, and then we very briefly take some time, and with the understanding that this is a 101 training, to talk about transgender youth and their unique needs. I think this is very important because transgender youth are more at risk in a lot of different ways. They're more at risk of being homeless. They are much more at risk for attempting suicide. And so it's important that folks understand their unique needs. They're much more likely to be victimized in school, in other environments. And there are still a lot of ways that we need to be providing and supporting these young people. So we talked very briefly just about transgender folks and their identity, how this word might be used, how they might see the word, and some just very basic points around etiquette, which is the right way to ask questions, things to avoid, just to make sure that there's a very baseline level of competency around this topic. So now that we've given folks a whole big toolbox full of tools, we get to the fun part of the training. And somewhere along this point, again, we would be, it would have taken longer than it's taking us together. We would make sure folks have a break, because I think that's really important, because you're learning a lot, and there's maybe even some emotions going on at this point. So then we go into providing support as an ally. And so now this is the part where we talk about, okay, what are you going to do with all this information that you've been learning? It's a great quote I like to use from Andy Warhol, which is, they always say time changes things, but actually you have to change them yourself. So if we're going to make something happen, we've got to get our hands dirty and do it. So then we go through a list really of suggestions for allies. We talk about coming out, that we really shouldn't tell a young person whether to come out, when to come out, or how to come out, because those things are really all their decisions. What we can do is help guide them through that and help them think about staying safe through the coming out process. We can help them create a list of pros and cons. Is now the right time to come out, or is it not the right time to come out, and why? The Trevor Project has just recently launched a coming out guide for young people. You can go to our website. It's actually available online, and it's also available in template form. And that's part of what it does, is it helps young people to create a list of pros and cons and think about coming out, and is it the right time, and is it safe for me to come out? And if I do, who am I going to tell? And if things don't go well, who am I going to call? So it really helps them to think about that. We talk about the fact that it's not appropriate to share someone's sexual orientation or gender identity without their permission. Again, that seems like something that would be common knowledge, but you know, the fact that you shouldn't share it with a parent without the youth's consent, you shouldn't share it with a colleague, with your fellow teacher, fellow school counselor, that it's inappropriate to share that information because we don't know how those people feel about these issues. We talk about the importance of having a visible sign to show that you're supportive to LGBTQ people, and I tell stories about the importance of that at this point of how really valuable it is to actually have, maybe it's just a sticker in your office that shows you're supportive, but something that shows that you're a source of support. We talk about standing up and speaking out against homophobic language, why that's important. And then we talk about your own coming out process. So after this training, folks may have to come out themselves as an ally to LGBTQ people. And again, I have stories I share around that, around friends that I've had who tell their own story of coming out to their families and their friends as being someone who supports LGBT people, and it's important to respect that that in itself is a coming out experience. And again, just other guidelines. Thinking about using inclusive language, you talk about what that looks like, and that it's okay to make a mistake, and I think that that's really important to remember. And most importantly, that one person really can make a difference. And then what we do is we go through case studies, and I'm not going to lead us through these now, but just to say that I think it's important to give people an opportunity to say, okay, I've gotten all this information, well, what does this look like in real life? So these two case studies are good examples for folks both in higher ed and then also in K through 12 schools. It talks about a transgender youth and then also a youth who would identify as queer, and one, they're experiencing problems with their family, the other, they're being victimized. And so how do you handle that? The second case, actually, you're having to talk to a colleague because a colleague has said some things that are inappropriate. These are very real-life scenarios. So it's good to give folks an opportunity to break up into groups and say, how would I handle that if that was something I was faced with? So we've given a lot of tools for action items, ways that you can individually do things. Some folks like to also think about policy, and so we give folks an opportunity to understand that this topic is affected by policies that exist, both at the state level and at the federal level. And so we talk about primarily at the state level laws that exist and don't exist to protect LGBTQ youth. This is an example of anti-bullying and harassment laws that include LGBTQ young people. And then also suicide prevention training, which is really important, as all of you know. And actually there's a few states that could be added to this map since it was created. We know Maine has passed a law. So it's really important that educators are getting this training, as I'm sure all of you agree, and that that's an important issue for this population for a lot of reasons. And then we talk about how you can advocate at the local level, and a lot of people are interested in doing that for inclusive policies that would help this group. A little delay here, and it's not wanting to go to my next slide. I'm a little bit frozen here, so hang on just a moment. Let's see if it will go down to the next slide for us. Okay, there we go. So after doing all of that, then we'll talk about the programs the Trevor Project has. I think a really important thing for people is to not feel that they are alone in this process. And so it's really important for people to know that they're not alone, that they have resources, that no one person has to know everything. And so that's partly why we go through these resources. And what I would say when we think about, we're going to talk in a moment about how to incorporate this into the work that you do, that it's important to know that there are national resources on this topic, and then most likely there are local resources. And it's really important to find what local resources you have. So is there a youth group in your community that's meeting regularly for LGBTQ young people? Is there a local LGBT center? Are there what's called gay straight alliances in your school? To know those things so that folks can loop themselves into that is really important, and to know that, again, they're not alone on this topic. So the Trevor Project, the resources we provide, and I want to walk through this in case those of you on this line are not aware, our prime service, the service that we started with really was a 24/7 lifeline. So it is a suicide prevention and crisis intervention lifeline. You see the number there on the screen in front of you. We take about 35,000 calls a year from young people from all over the country. The majority of our calls do come from the South and the Midwest. And it is exactly as it would describe. It is a suicide prevention line. Youth can call and talk about other things, but at its core, that's really the goal of that service, is to be there specifically in the context of suicide prevention. In addition to the lifeline, we also do chat. So young people can chat with us via IM on their computers, and as all of us who work with youth know, that is a way that many youth are wanting to reach out. And we get about as many chat interactions as we do calls on the lifeline every year. We also have started a new program, Trevor Text, so young people can text us from their phone. Which, again, is really important. You know, I myself, I'm not of this age demographic, but if someone calls me on my cell phone frequently, I will not answer the call and text them back and say, hey, you know, what's going on? You know, many folks prefer to text nowadays rather than chat, and that's just an additional barrier that we can remove if we can make that service available via chat, which the Trevor Project has done. There's other services we provide which are non-crisis related, with the understanding that the reason why LGBTQ youth are at higher risk for suicide to a large extent has to do with a sense of isolation, of feeling alone. And really all of our services are designed to decrease that sense of isolation. Trevor Space is our social networking site for LGBTQ youth and their allies. And we have over 70,000 members. It's actually a global community. It's kept very safe and secure. It's only young people that are online and are part of it. And it's essentially like a Facebook, but just for LGBTQ young people. We also have a program called Ask Trevor. So young people can write into us, and then we respond to them. So this is a non-crisis related forum. If they are in crisis, they would be prompted to actually call our lifeline. But if they have questions, they need someone to talk to, they're having issues with their friends, with their family, they have questions about sexual orientation, then they can reach out to us via this means. And then we have a robust education program, which are the programs that I run along with my team. So the Trevor Lifeguard Workshop was the program at the beginning I told you that I would talk about. It is our suicide prevention program for youth, and it is listed in the Best Practice Registry. It is a video-based curriculum available to people anywhere in the country. So there are 3 modules. It talks about self-care. It talks about how to recognize the warning signs of suicide, how to appropriately respond, and there are also lesson plans for folks to use that incorporate information if you're doing it with a non-LGBT group of youth to talk about why LGBTQ youth are treated negatively and why that's important to think about. And then when you're doing this curriculum with an LGBTQ group, so which would be your target group who's at higher risk, to talk about ways that maybe internally within the LGBTQ community they can be more supportive of each other, because sometimes the community is not as supportive internally as it should be. So how can we support each other as friends? And that curriculum is available free of charge via the Trevor Project. We've done a lot of evaluation of that curriculum, and so I would really say about that curriculum, we think about tools that are available. Again, you know, there's a lot of different resources. If you're thinking about doing suicide prevention with LGBTQ youth, as I said in the beginning, it's really important to not just take an adult resource and try to make it applicable, or just take a video from off the internet and make it applicable. It's really important to think, is this program I'm doing, is it really based on research? Is it based on best approaches to this topic? Is it really going to be effective? And so I think this is a program we're very proud of that we've been doing evaluation of for 3 years now. We know that it's being very effective and it's being used in various places across the country. The Trevor Resource Kit is a packet of materials, and so it is one way that you can get curriculum about the Lifeguard Workshop. You can actually order it as a DVD, which would come in the Resource Kit. And there are other things for you to put up on the wall in your space, posters from some of our campaigns, which I'll show you in a moment. So there are those resources which you can get and order the Resource Kit, which is also free of charge from our website. And then the Trevor Ally Training, which is what you've been exposed to now, and then Trevor Care Training, which, again, as Michelle will talk about at the end, we're going to be doing next week, which talks about the suicide risk for LGBTQ youth. And this is designed for professionals to understand why the population is at higher risk, and based upon research, what can we actually do to create a difference in those suicide attempt rates in the long term. 2 other things, and for some reason the text is off there at the top, but 2 other things that, or 3 other things I should say, that the Trevor Project is very excited about is a partnership with Cognito Interactive, which many of you probably know about. You may be using their programs in some other way. The Trevor Project and Cognito Interactive in collaboration with Campus Pride, another LGBT org, launched 3 online training interactives in the month of October. So one of them is designed for middle school and high school educators. It's called Step In, Speak Up. And then 2 are designed for higher education, one actually for students, which is LGBT on campus for students, and then one for faculty and staff, which is LGBT on campus for faculty and staff. All 3 of them are really fantastic. They can be accessed, of course, as a group, or they can be accessed by individuals, which is a new model for Cognito. And you can access all of these through our website. So if you go to our website, you can learn about each of them, and you as an individual can access them, or they can be accessed by a group, either a state or an individual college or university. One thing I'll say about them that I'm happy about is they're very inclusive of trans issues. So the avatar, one of them you see there in the picture far to the left, identifies as trans. They talk about trans issues. There's scenarios about trans issues. And also bisexual folks, which are frequently kind of forgotten as parts of these conversations. So they're very inclusive interactives, and so we're very, very excited to be a part of that partnership. And then some other things that I think are important in the context of our conversation is that, you know, a big part of course, suicide prevention, when I go to the Garrett Lee Smith Grantee Conference and all the grantees, you have the opportunity to display what you're doing. A lot of folks talk about their public awareness campaigns and things that they do just to build awareness, right, which is really awesome. So if your grant is doing something that's, whether or not really it's LGBT related, because these resources are not LGBT specific per se, we've created 2 different campaigns. The first one's Talk to Me, which is we do activities across the Suicide Prevention Week and Month in September, which is fantastic. And there are all different ways to get involved. There's online pledges. There's a kit you can get with armbands and face tattoos, all these things. I think it's a really fun campaign. It's been very effective. There's T-shirts. There is a PSA that's related to it, as you can see there with Kevin McHale from Glee. And it really is a public health campaign. Its goal is to decrease the stigma around mental illness, depression, and asking for help. So if you're thinking, oh, I want to do something, and then it loops people back to our resources. So it's a good way if you want to build awareness about our lifeline and our resources because you want LGBTQ youth to feel supported, it would be a great way to connect folks. The other thing which we just launched is Ask for Help. And so it really is our PSA campaign, which we're using across the year, again, with the same public health goals and upstream prevention goals. And there are a variety of resources available for that, including posters, videos, and other things that you can use. So, again, no need to kind of recreate the wheel. There are some tools that are here, and, again, refer back to our resources if you're interested in that. So as we come to the closure of that type of training, and we're going to segue into how you can use these tools, what we encourage people to do before they leave this type of training is not to leave without thinking, how am I going to use all this? And so we really break people up into groups and say, let's create a plan. The plan will be different for everyone. Some people it will be very small steps. Other people it will be larger things. But have them think about a plan in 3 areas. Individual actions. What are individual things they can start doing or stop doing? What are policies and procedures they might want to see change? Maybe they're at their school or facility that they feel need to be more inclusive. And how can they educate and build awareness with others? Because as we know in the suicide prevention movement, we have to have conversations about suicide prevention. We have to let people know the importance of having this conversation. And it's the same thing about this population who's at higher risk of suicide. We have to start having a conversation. We have to have those conversations, you know, around the water cooler and at the dinner table, to start building a movement to help people to understand why we need to support these young people. And then we end with this statement, which I think is important. One ally can make all the difference. And the research shows that one person really can decrease the risk for suicide for an LGBTQ young person. And so it really is even just one person, the individuals that go through this training, each one of them has the ability to decrease the risk for young people, which is so important. So that really is the ally training and what it looks like. And again, as I said, there will be modules. There are modules for higher education that are specific for K through 12 educators, for health professionals. And then, you know, as an addition to that, is something that really helps in addition to that, those tools that we have available from Cognitive Interactive really help people to practice those skills because practice is so important. And so those interactives really help people to think about scenarios, how they would interact in those scenarios, and so those are great supplements to this type of training. So I want to go now really in the rest of the time that we have together to talk about how this has been used actually on the ground. And so this is where I want to turn it over to Morgan, for you to talk about what you've been doing with this training and how it's been working in the state of Missouri.
Sure. Thank you, Nathan. So in Missouri, we've been excited to work with the Garrett Lease grant, and that's through the department that we have, which is the Missouri Suicide Prevention Project. That project is made up of different hubs around our state, and so in collaboration with Trevor, we've been using this ally training as well as the CARE training in order to sort of talk about LGBT suicide prevention and just LGBT competency in general. And so my background working directly as a practitioner with these young people, I sort of knew a lot about the population in general, but I've learned a lot in the process of doing this work. And so one of the things that I think this slide sort of talks about is that the difference, again, between the competency and awareness education. And so we find a lot of Missouri, at least, needs still that very base level sort of education, right? So a lot of it is actually the ally training, not necessarily the care training that we're going to talk about next week on the next week's webinar. And the reason why is in the state of Missouri, and you can see those slides with the maps, we have sort of none of those laws or policies that are sort of great for LGBT folks or young people. And so there's a lack of sort of just the baseline understanding. And so I find myself in these trainings, asking a lot of questions before I do the training to get a better understanding sometimes of where they are as an audience, who they are as an audience. And so I've, learned how to sort of take and back up and sort of say, like, okay, great, like we need to sort of just start with a basic 101. And again, having that background was really helpful, but I would say that I learned a lot in the fact that I used to do trainings before getting hooked up into Trevor Ally Trainings, and I used to do those trainings where I would basically come in and have young people that I work with come in and tell their personal stories. And while that was great and it really helped in a lot of ways some young people talk about this openly, it could actually be very triggering for them, and in fact it could be pretty harmful. And so I would say that in a state where there's not a whole lot of resources, right, like we're just trying to figure it out as much as we can, it's been really helpful to connect with something that's already sort of on the best practice registry and already has like some understanding behind it so that we don't have to recreate the wheel as Nathan was talking about. So we use ally training a lot in a lot of our audiences are there. And then on a sort of a statewide level, I sort of work to educate those hubs that are part of our suicide prevention project. And those folks are usually at the place where I either need to do an ally training with them or we can do a care training. And those are folks that usually have a different level of competency around the work. And I found myself needing to be very flexible in the ways that I do that. So, for instance, at our last suicide prevention conference here in Missouri, I led a room of faith leaders in a conversation around LGBT youth suicide prevention, which so all of the conversation was in that frame or whatever. And I just have been learning how to be really flexible around ways to have these conversations and have them in a very meaningful way. So, letting the conversations be sort of really thoughtful and intentional. And I've learned a lot about why it's so important to do that sort of modeling of the creating of the safe space. Because I think in a lot of my past work, it was just assumed, Morgan, you work with, LGBT young people. Whenever you come into a room, it happens, right? And I think that having the people, no matter whether or not they're working with adults or with students, that's an activity I think is really great for both working with students and with adults. So in the next steps, what we're hoping to do is actually train some community volunteers to actually be trainers. So I've been doing the ally and care trainings here in the state of Missouri for the last 2 years. And the hope is that we would get a group of folks that are community leaders and volunteers, folks that maybe they're already doing LGBT trainings, but then to sort of give them this and train them on how to use Ally. And I think that that's something that Trevor is moving towards across the country as well. So that'll be a way to sort of get training on how to be a trainer, if you will. And that's sort of our next step for the next 6 months to a year. We're going to be working on folks that we already have relationships with, hubs in our state that are already doing this work like you all around the country, and trying to train them so that they can use Ally and Care in their programs. So I think that that's all I had for my slide.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. And we'll have, again, opportunities for questions and answers at the end. So if you have questions specific to some of the things that Morgan has shared, that would be great. You know, what I would say kind of to add to that, Morgan, is that, you know, the grant in Missouri, Scott Perkins, who's the grant officer there at the Missouri Institute of Mental Health, approached us and asked us to work with him because he was going to write LGBT as a substantive part of his grant. And so we're very committed to doing that. We also are an official partner with the Garrett Lee Smith Grant in the state of New York, and we do trainings with them. And then the state of California, who has a Garrett Lee Smith Grant that is focused primarily and only really on LGBT issues. And so the kind of the takeaway from this too, and hearing Morgan talk, is that we're very committed to working with grantees who have this written in either as a substantive part or a lesser part of their grant, to make sure that you have the tools that you need to really be successful in doing that part of your work. So here, this is the part where I'm going to talk about kind of our recommendations for everything that we've just talked about and what our plans are moving forward. And you heard Morgan talk about that a little bit towards the end. We are going to be launching a Train the Trainer program, and really Morgan and Beth, who is Morgan's counterpart in Missouri, and then we already have a few folks doing this in California also, we're really the start of that. We've been doing this now for several years. We've trained other people who we call regional coordinators, if they're in this advanced capacity, to use our trainings, our full range of trainings. So we're going to be launching a broader Train the Trainer network starting in February, which will train people to be certified trainers for us with Trevor Ally, which is what you've just seen, Trevor Care, which if you log on next week you will see, with the Lifeguard Workshop Program, which is our youth program, and then how to use those campaigns that I showed you too. What's the effective way of using those campaigns? So we'll be launching that in February. It is going to be a 2-day training, so it'll be a fairly substantive training. And through that, what will come out on the other end is that folks will be part of a certified trainer network through the Trevor Project, so that they will have ongoing resources and support from us that will support you on an ongoing basis, that you'll be certified by us to do these specific trainings. There'll be ongoing professional development that we will offer on, you know, adaptations to training, what's the right way to make adaptations, if you want to take just part of this training and attach it to other trainings that you're doing, how is the effective way and the right way to do that. So we're very excited about the potential of that. I know I've talked probably with many of you on the phone, and I know there's an eagerness to use these tools, and so we're very excited that we feel we're at a place where we can launch that very soon. So we're at the part now where we'd like to have questions and answers, and we have quite a bit of time. So if we'd like to open it up now for either Morgan or myself, that would be great.
Thank you. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Please make sure your phone is unmuted and record your name when prompted. Again, that is *1, and it does take a couple moments for that first question. We do have a question. One moment, please. Melissa Heinen, your line is open.
Hello. I'm from Minnesota with the Minnesota Department of Health as a suicide prevention coordinator, and I was interested in the Trevor Lifeline. Based on the number of chats and phone calls that you are receiving, is it possible just to get a count for a state as far as how many were managed in the prior year?
Yes, that's a great question, and we can do that, in fact. If my email will appear at the end on the next slide. If you'd like to email me, I can give you the number specifically for your state. We can also look potentially at Trevor Space and see how many Trevor Space members we have from your state, right, which sometimes is an interesting thing to look at, because I think sometimes people will join that social networking site, especially if they're feeling very isolated, that they don't have support in their community. So we definitely can work with you to provide those numbers if that would be helpful to you.
It would. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Just a reminder, to ask a question, please press *1 and record your name, please. And at this time, I'm showing no further questions.
Okay, great. Well, that means we must have done a good job. I'm going to put here, that's my email address if you would like to reach out to me. And I did not put Morgan's there. Morgan, would you like to state your email address in case folks want to reach out to you?
Sure. My email address is morgan@missourigsanetwork.org.
Great. So please feel free to reach out. Again, we're very excited to launch the Trainer Network in the spring, and we're eager to work with folks who are interested in becoming part of that Certified Trainer Network. Thank you so much for your attention. And Michelle, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. This was really outstanding, and I really appreciate Nathan and Morgan for taking the time to present this really crucial information to us, and I appreciate everyone who took the time to join us today. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be posted on the sprc.org website in about a week or so. Again, that's the sprc.org website, which stands for the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. So that's in case you want to replay this information, or if you want to share it with other folks that couldn't join us, you'll be able to do that. So you'll see that on their website in about a week or so. And just as a reminder, next week on December the 12th, we will do a second webinar with Trevor Project on the Trevor Care training, which, as Nathan mentioned, is designed to increase your familiarity with this resource, which is about recognizing and responding to warning signs in LGBTQ youth and how to create a tailored response that works for them. So mark your calendars for that. That's December 12th. That's a week from today, from 3 to 4:30 Eastern. And we will be sending out another notification over the SPRC website, or the listserv, just as a reminder with the link and the dial-in information as well. And if you're not on that listserv and you'd like me to send you that information for the one next Thursday on Trevor Care, then you can email me at michelle.carnes, that's C-A-R-N-E-S, at SAMHSA, SAMHSA.hhs.gov. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week for the Trevor Care webinar.
And this concludes today's conference. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.